Cool. I'm Jesse, and we have an episode I'm pretty excited about. We've been kind of talking about getting this going for a few weeks now. It's going to be something pretty different than anything that we've normally done before, but I do think it's going to be something that most people are going to enjoy, and it will be kind of throwing together two worlds that I am both really enjoy. I'm a theology nerd. I've said for a long time that theology is my love language. But beyond that, I am a very big, several different fandoms. So I came across through Facebook a podcast called Systematic Geekology. And through that, I ended up getting in touch with Christian. He's our guest tonight. And we're going to be talking a little bit about predetermination, predestination, and Spiderman. And what connections can we see there? So, Christian, if there's anything else you want to throw out, kind of an introduction, what qualifies you to talk about Spider-Man and predestination?
Well, sure. As far as Spider-Man is concerned, I'm his number one fan. And I'll fight anyone else who tries to say that against me and to try and take the number one spot. I grew up watching him with my dad, watching the animated series in the 90s and got into the comics from there and just continued to fall in love with this guy who is like so outclassed by most everyone he fights and just keeps going through it while having this very witty personality while he's being terrified at the same time. And he's covering that with jokes. Like, I identify with that so much. But as far as like who I am and why we can discuss the Bible together like this, well, I'm Christian Ashley. I am completed 1 full year of seminary right now. I'm at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Okay. And like Jesse said, I am a host of Systematic Geekology. I'm a frequent guest on the Whole Church podcast in the same network, and I run my own show, Let Nothing Move You, where I go chapter by chapter, verse by verse through the Bible, like what you're doing with John, but I'm almost finished with Luke right now.
Okay. Well, it sounds awesome. And we'll, anybody that's interested, we'll put links in the description of wherever you're listening and watching this at. So if you guys are interested, you can jump on some of their other content as well. The one of the reasons this whole idea really stuck out to me. We were talking right before we got on here that admittedly I'm more of a Star Wars nerd than a Marvel or DC. I do like some, but one thing that really it captivated me, and it has continued to do so from the time I was really, really little. I didn't like to read. I absolutely hated to read, but I absolutely loved the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Now, it's a little different, different genre, stuff like that. But the idea of, I liked it for the story when I was younger. And then even now, as I've gotten older, I continue to, I'll pull them out and read them again. Whenever they've come out with a movie or, they're talking about the series they're going to be coming out with here shortly, hopefully. But I've always enjoyed it, and even more so as I really got into theology and seeing the intentional Christian themes that are put there by C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
But then even beyond that, I started to, there's tons of different shows, movies, stuff like that it's just people that don't even realize it. They're throwing a Christian message in, because it's a good story. And I think there's a reason behind that. It kind of goes back to, even one that's frequent, the hero archetype. We see that perfectly with Jesus and who he was, and coming in for all of humanity. So I really like the concept. I really like the idea. I think anybody that listens to this, if you even have a passing interest in a fandom at all, and these guys have everything. Just scrolling through anything that you could possibly be interested in, they've probably discussed to some extent. So we are talking a little more specifically tonight about Spider-Man and the idea of predetermination, predestination, free will. Um, just kind of how maybe you can see some elements of that in there. I know for me, so I've my son. Well, both of my sons are pretty big Spider-Man fans, um, far more than I currently am or really have ever been. But they're really big into the Miles Morales Spider-Man because that's the new Spider-Man for their
Yes.
generation, and so we went and saw the most recent movie, and it's been out for a little while. Don't. I'll go ahead and say spoiler alert just in case. I don't think we're going to give away anything, but I like
To be safe.
to preface that just in case. Uh, but the idea that as I'm watching through, I see it's a pretty common theme throughout. But the whole idea of kind of being able to control your destiny and what happens, or are there things that happen to us that, I mean, they call canon events.
Yes.
And now my kids run around the house all the time. Anything happens, they're like, "That's a canon event." Um, but the whole idea that there are things that have to happen to us that we can't control. Um, and I remember even sitting and watching it, I was like man, like this is deep for a kids movie.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just anybody that hasn't seen it, the movie's just phenomenal. Anyways, but there's a lot of like really good story, really good substance in it. Um, but I'll turn it over to you, Christian. See, how do you want to set this up, or some first points you want to talk about, or how do you want to head at this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can go ahead and start with that idea of what constitutes a canon event. That's something they've invented the term for the movie, but it exists within comics and TV shows. It's kind of like, I don't know if you're a Doctor Who guy, but it's a fixed moment in time as
Yep.
well. It's like this is something that has to happen. And I mean, we can argue, I mean, from our own point of view as Christians, like a fixed point in time, that canon event is that Jesus has to die on the cross and be resurrected. Otherwise, what are we here for? And
Yeah.
if, I mean, I'm going through that point right now. I was just writing down my notes for Luke 23 earlier, and just to see there's so many opportunities that Pilate could have stopped himself if he just asserted himself more. The Jewish leaders, if they had just listened to what he had to say, they could have done something. Like maybe there could have been a popular revolt that said, "Oh no, you're imprisoning Jesus. We can't have this happen." Like, but Jesus doesn't defend himself either because he knows this has to happen.
Yeah.
So how does that fit in our own lives? At our moments that have to happen for us? I mean, are we truly left? Is there such thing as free will? Or is it just predestination? Or is it both? And I'm going to argue for the both.
And I I'd kind of thought about that too. So I've thought about free will a little bit. The whole idea. It's not been a topic I've done a real deep dive on, and I I realized too right before we hopped on here that I had not even, like, we discussed through email that we were going to talk about free will, but I don't think either one of us knew where the other one stood on, like, what beliefs were or anything like that. But
No.
and that's something that um, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it's not a salvation issue.
Yes.
Um, I think that there's people that I watch frequently that I highly respect their opinion that differ from me on this. There's a couple Calvinists that I really like, and they are very hard that there's no free will. It's complete determination, or whatever the word is, determinism. But it is 100% set. You can't change what's going to happen. Like, it's already been set in motion. God kind of flicked the first domino at the beginning, and everything right now is just those falling as they were set up to fall. So this is not an issue that has anything to do with salvation. There's people that are on both sides of it that are going to be in heaven, and one day we'll figure out who's right. But I like the idea of possibly both, and that's one kind of why I was thinking about this beforehand. I think I was thinking more just like my personal life or the people around me, um, things like that. I hadn't even honestly even thought about the idea of Jesus coming and dying on a cross. Like that was a something that had to happen. And, there are multiple different places where that could have gone off the rails. I mean, Jesus at any point in time could have said, I can't do this. Like I'm done. It's not worth it. And I mean, thank God that he didn't. It could have been, you know, uh, Peter cuts the guard's ear off when they come to get Jesus. Well, what if Peter didn't stop there?
Yeah.
What if the rest of the disciples decided that what they're going to take up arms too, and this is our leader, this is our Messiah. Like we're not going to let you come take him. Um, and I think that was a real possibility. A lot of Jews in the day were expecting the Messiah to come as a warrior leader to overthrow Rome and set up his empire there in the physical. Um, but no, that's a really interesting way to think of it too. Like I said, I had not even thought about the whole idea of that kind of factoring into the predetermination, the canon event, if you will.
Yeah.
That's I like that. That's an interesting way to look at that.
Especially, like I said, there's so many times when this could have gone off the rails. I mean, like you mentioned, like the disciples could have risen up and said, hey, this is our guy. You could have had Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane being like, yeah, Lord, take this cup away from me, but not my will, yours be done. And then him to say, nah, my will be done, and reject
Yeah,
that. And of course, he would be sinning in that moment. We had that moment too, very early in Jesus' ministry, where Satan comes up and says, just bow down before me and get away from this mission. What if Jesus had said yes to that? And obviously, I'm going to say he never would have said that, but like, there's still that possibility that what if it were me instead of Jesus in that moment, what would I have
right.
said? And and for me, ultimately, when it comes to this conversation of predestination and free will, it kind of falls into it falls into logic for me. I see how God presents himself in scripture, and I see how, like in the garden, he gives the option of doing everything but this one thing. That tells me he knows it's possible for Adam and Eve to make that choice not to do the one to do the one thing he told them not to do.
Yeah,
And but at the same time, why would he set that up if he knew that was a possibility? But I think, to me, that just means that God really cares about what we think, even if that means we say no to him and reject them.
yeah, and I think that's and kind of how I've viewed it, and I've explained it like this a few times too. Um, and I think it's weird. It ties into so much other stuff. Even it kind of ties into the whole idea of the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
Why is there evil in the world, or why does God allow it? And I think that is directly because he allows us to have free will and free choice. You can't truly have free will unless you can't truly have choice unless there's multiple choices. Um, you can't truly choose to love God and to follow God unless you have the option to not love God and
Mm-hmm.
not follow God. But that's looking back at the garden and everything that's there too. There's just, I don't, there's so much as I've been listening to people talk. Few podcasts I listen to, I've kind of intentionally went and looked for stuff that they've talked about the topic of free will, predetermination, things like that, and then going through on my own and different seeing different stories in the Bible from that perspective, not just as a narrative that's already been written, but like more in the moment, like what could have happened, other possibilities. Um, I think one. So, and this is kind of getting into the predetermination side, and I'll be interested to hear. I know you said you think it's a little bit of both. I'll be interested to hear kind of how you set that up. I know for me, uh, there's some verses we see. It talks about how Jesus was the lamb that was slain before the foundations of the earth. So that whole plan was already into place before we were here. There's scriptures that talk about, like God hardened Pharaoh's heart and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think we have ways to kind of explain what's really happening there. But the whole idea that um, a common pushback I see with this topic is, how can you know um, if God knows everything that everyone's going to do, if He is truly omnipotent, then how how is that actually that you have a choice? Um,
Yeah.
and I think one way that it's it's been beneficial for me to understand it after having kids because and I'll use this example frequently with people. I've got so we've got 4 kids now, and we've got a fifth on the way. But
All right.
our our 3 oldest, with them, I could sit down in front of them. I could have somebody pick out 10 random packs of candy, um, and I can tell you with a high degree of certainty which one they're going to pick, regardless of what candy you were to pick out for them, or movies, or food, or whatever. Um, so I'm still fallible. Obviously, I don't have a perfect understanding of my children, but I have a very, very deep, intimate knowledge of them. And so, if I can still, kind of see what they're going to do, knowing that I'm not perfect, that my knowledge of them isn't perfect, then I think just taking that to the next step of God being perfect and knowing them better than I know them, than they know them, than anyone ever will. I don't think it's that really much of a stretch to get to the idea that God could know all of our choices that we're going to make, everything that we're going to do before we do it, but we still have the free will to make those choices. Now, it's not a perfect analogy, but we rarely have those when we're trying to use
Yes.
finite things to describe an infinite being. So,
Yeah. We
um,
are very limited by our knowledge and our ability to speak and comprehend matters, as you said, finite beings. I mean, I a while back did had a debate on the Whole Church podcast on Dr. Thomas Ord. Tom, a very smart guy. He wrote a book called like the death of omnipotence or something like that, and the birth of
okay.
omnipotence is he coined it. It's like turn to God is loving, but God can't control everything as much as we think He does. And I'm obviously on the take of God is omnipotent, but you go through the idea of, well, God can't sin, so that means God cannot do everything. You get to that logical concept. Can God create a boulder so big that He Himself can't lift it? Can He create
Yep.
a burrito so hot that He Himself cannot eat it? All that
Yeah.
jazz. And like, sure, that's our human way of saying God is all powerful, but that's the best we can get to describe it using our paltry language. And I say that as someone who studied the English language more than I want to, as a writer and all that. Yeah, it's not fun. I despise this language. But when we go back to God and like this idea of predestination versus my free will, like if we take how I view God as someone who is outside of the time as I understand it, as in I am moving constantly forward, God Himself has always been, always is, and always will be. Like, of course, He knows what I'm going to do. So could He not also have planned for that, knowing who I am as a person, to ordain things to be where, oh, Christian will make this decision because of how I designed him, not because I said, Christian, do this, but because,
Right.
yeah, like we go to your example of Pharaoh, like for the first 2 verses, it said Pharaoh hardened his
Yep.
heart. Then we go to God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, that to me says, well, God just confirmed the choices that Pharaoh made so that His glory could be made manifest in the world through the 10 plagues and Israel being rescued with means that they never could have done themselves without His involvement.
Yep. That's with the Pharaoh one. I actually watched a that ended up being a kind of a center point for, who was it? It was two Calvinists debating two non-Calvinists. I think Leighton Flowers was one of the non, and then Jonathan Pritchett maybe. I don't remember who the Calvinists were. But that was one point that they really honed in on, both sides. And it was I think how Leighton Flowers ended up explaining it wasn't that God made Pharaoh do something that he wasn't going to do on his own. It was Pharaoh already had the choice to do it multiple times. Pharaoh already hardened his own heart multiple times. And so then when it gets to God hardening Pharaoh's heart, God is just basically pushing along the process that Pharaoh was already doing on his own, just kind of putting it on God's timeline where he wanted it at, which I thought was an interesting take. And that's one that I hadn't really known really how to answer that before. But as I've been getting in and looking at some of the stuff, there's so many verses that you can really look and, I mean, almost see either way on it. So with that, how would you set up the specific idea of it being kind of both? Do you have any more with that, as far as it is kind of predetermined, but we still have free will along with that?
Yeah. There's a couple of verses. I don't have them all off the top of my head. That's why I have this handy dandy tab on the other side here to help me out.
Oh, you're fine.
Because my memory is atrocious.
If any verses, anything like that you want to bring up when we do the, I'll edit it all before we put it out there, and I'll actually throw them up on the screen so we can see specifically what's being said.
I mean, there's some verses like we get into Revelation 3:20, where Jesus is saying to the church, hey, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him, and he with me. Well, that tells me there's an option there. I hear him either way, but do I say yes or do I say no? And that choice in that moment seems like it's up to me to some point in time. Then we get into other things like, goodness gracious, where was I going to go next? I mean, in verses 2 in like 2 Peter 3, verse 9, we see that the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. That means that God is setting things up, knowing who people are. He's got to be patient to give them time to think things on their own to come to him. But then at that same time, and I don't have it with me, it's the verse that no man chooses God. Well, that tells me that left to my own devices, without God's intervention at some point in time, I'm never going to choose him. Or some people would take that in the predestination sense of, well, you're never going to have a choice to begin with. So right. That's an argument against what I would have as well, because I want to give every side their own fair point in this.
Right. No, that's good. I actually heard this was kind of an interesting take on it. Earlier today, there was somebody I was watching. I don't remember who it was, but he was basically saying someone had given him a question. Their church said regarding that scripture in Revelation about the behold, I stand at the door and knock, and they took it as what's it? There are people in their church that they believe in Jesus, they believe everything that's required for salvation, but they have not, I guess they say, quote unquote, heard that knocking, and so they're waiting to hear that before they can actually be saved. And what they're saying is, and I think from how the question was worded, it sounded almost like a predetermination type thing. They were, I wish I remember who had it on there, but it was, you could be aware of all this and still not ever hear that knocking. And so they had people that were in their congregation that believed that even though they believe in Jesus, they believe that he is God, they believe that he came and died for their sins and rose again, they are thinking, they're unsure of whether or not they're actually going to spend eternity with him or not. And that's something that um, kind of with um, the whole, I guess, the Calvinist idea overall, when it comes to free will, I've I've never really liked. I've always had some issue with, but the whole idea of, and there's been several I talked to that they can't tell you for sure if they are one of the elect, because they don't know if in 10 years if they're predestined to walk away from the faith, or and it's that mindset is, I mean, it's crazy for me to think about. And now, obviously, this isn't. There are some Calvinists that aren't as hard predetermination, and this. I mean, there's tons of different flavors, but just the idea of not being able to have the security and the hope that we have is, and for me, is just going through life having that is so much better, knowing that that we have that hope that we can look forward to. And the idea that there are believers that are going to be in heaven, but they don't necessarily have that they can cling to now in this life. It's a crazy thought.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's a deep one right there. It makes me think. My grandfather passed away about a year ago on my dad's side, and while my dad was giving the message in front of everyone, he was telling a story of how my grandfather came to faith as a very young boy. But if you had ever seen him in his life, you would go, this man doesn't know Jesus. Not as like he's living like hell or anything like that, but like he wouldn't go to church. He wouldn't read his Bible. He wouldn't talk about Jesus to anyone else. But like my dad talked to my great uncle, who was a pastor, and said, hey, like, I'm worried about my daddy. Like, is he saved? And my great uncle took him aside and said, he is. He's just one of those people. They heard, they received it joyfully, and then nothing's happened.
Yeah.
And like there's been fruit, but it's not fruit that you're going to be like, unless you're looking for it, you're not going to see it. So to live your life in that sense of, I can't imagine that idea of, I don't know, I'm not secure. But once I said yes to Jesus, is there something else I have to do? It's like, to me, it's like one and done. And my anxiety and my depression really thank that fact that I can say, yes, I'm done, one and done. Because if I had to live in any way where I had to, keep going to my pastor and confess every single one of my sins to him, and I forget something, I would live in fear of like, oh no, maybe I'm not good enough because I didn't remember that one specific thing that I just forgot, not because I wanted to, but because that's how bad my memory is. Or it's like, or maybe I'm just not one of the special ones that are like, they're super into it. I haven't focused. I didn't read my Bible today. I didn't pray today. It's like, is God going to strip that away from me? It's like that fear, I don't think has any place whatsoever in the church. But I mean, if God has secured them and that's what they're still thinking, that's okay. He's got them.
Oh yeah. So I can kind of, on that specific topic. So I was raised Pentecostal. I still, the church I attend now is, I would say it's Pentecostal. But I I consider myself denominationally homeless. So like I said, the church I go to now is still Pentecostal. But I remember growing up, even in a church that, I mean, they believed in free will. They were very, very sin focused, though.
Okay.
And so it was like I grew up with a legitimate fear, like you were talking about, that I would forget to confess something that I did wrong, and then like the rapture would come, and then I'd just be left behind, and I was out of luck. Or like I would do something that I didn't even know was a sin and not confess. And so just, kind of along those lines, the idea of being able to have that security, being able to have that hope that we can rely on, we can count on regardless of what's going on. And I think too, so this, and kind of tying it back into the idea of free will, I think so recently, my wife and I, we just moved to South Georgia. We're living in Illinois, and part of the process, we were praying. We had both kind of felt like we were being led to move, so kind of praying, figuring that out. But that's something else I'd kind of thought about in that process of, what if I'm making the wrong decision? And that comes back to the idea that, it's not just a bunch of puppets that are moving around being controlled. Like we actually have to seek guidance. We have to pray and see what God wants us to do, and then act on that. But something else that I found as I really was thinking about that I thought was a very maybe humbling is the right word, idea that, even if I make the wrong step, let's say, we moved down here and we weren't actually supposed to, that wasn't God's plan. Our God is so great that doesn't matter. He can still orchestrate it to where we're going to be serving him. He can still orchestrate it to where we can turn back around and end up being in his will and doing what his plan is, even if, we step out of line from what he wants. I don't think there's, we did an episode this a couple weeks ago. I think it was one of our going through the Gospel of John. But, I talked about, I don't think anybody is actually still on their plan A that God had for their lives. And so just that whole idea that, and not even just for me, but with everybody in the entire world, that he knows us well enough to know what we're going to do, to know that we're going to mess up the original plan that he had for us, and the backup plan for that, and the backup plan for that. And, we're still going to, like it says in Romans, that he turns all things together for good for those who love God and called according to his purpose. So I think just the idea that we do have free will, that we can make decisions and we can make our own choices and stuff like that, and God is still able to orchestrate everything perfectly, is just, a crazy idea, and just shows the power and the intelligence, foresight, everything that's there that he has to have to be able to get all that, everything to work out. It's a really unique kind of just really interesting topic to kind of dig into, and there's so many different branches and things we could go down.
Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. We release new content every week, twice a week, once on Tuesday and once on Thursday. So don't forget to like and subscribe so you always see the newest content we have coming out. If you want to, you can check out a playlist that's down here, and it'll take you into another video of ours that we think you're probably going to enjoy. Thanks. God bless.